We are back now and we're going to open the floor to discussion. I'd like to first of all welcome our online moderator, Judith. Perhaps Judith could give us some indication of some of the questions and comments that have come online during the course of our discussions. And then we will turn to particular questions that people can raise in different in the different countries. So can we start with Judith?
Hello all. So the conversation on social media has been really interesting. One of the great things that people have been debating about is how state interventions have impacted social transformation. And so one Twitter user has commented that state-driven initiatives have overshadowed emphasis on social transformation. And another Twitter user said that these initiatives are supposed to mainstream, but they end up marginalizing gender equality issues. So maybe the speakers can actually comment on that and give a response. And now to specific questions that have been asked to specific speakers. One of the users from Twitter has posed a question if the Nigerian Ministry of Women can talk about any successful or positive outcomes of the ministry. And a second question to Kenya. So Kenyan women have had access to the highest office, but how have they used this? So those are the questions and the comments that are going on online. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. I think what I'll do is give each speaker a chance to respond to those questions, and then we'll turn to each country and ask what questions people would like to ask from their particular constituencies. So perhaps with the first question, we can ask Prof. Jacqueline to answer in Kenya, and then we'll ask Mrs. Nkechi and finally Jennifer.
Thank you, Sheila. The question I would speak to is how the women who have accessed high offices has delivered to women. And I would like to acknowledge the person who raised the question that I just managed to be a permanent secretary in the Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Development by June 2013. I think what I would say is that women have ensured that they expand the space by pushing the level. For example, in Kenya, part of what has happened is to bring greater structure on the government interventions, therefore saying that we don't just leave issues to a ministry of gender that might, by its definition, be seen not to be at par or equal to the finance ministry or devolution and planning or any other such ministry, and to then bring the presidency, the highest office, in place. I would want to suggest that, as I indicated in my presentation, it is important for the person raising the question and the audience to know that the spaces within which decisions are made, even in the state, have male culture and tend to have males as authority. So those women who get on board seek to find ways of negotiating and managing the dynamics, and it was useful if we can get those who are outside the state to bridge the gap and help to maximize and not make it the women's burden, but see how everybody can hold the structure accountable. Thank you.
Back to South Africa.
If we could, thank you very much. I'd like now to throw the question back to Nigeria, where there's both a general question about state intervention and how this has impacted social transformation, and the comment that the state has really overshadowed any processes of transformation, and that mainstreaming, the big criticism of mainstreaming, is that it has sidelined women's issues rather than, in fact, bringing them to the mainstream. that mainstreaming is in effect sidelining, and also perhaps to just ask the specific answer, the specific question is if the Ministry of Women has had any positive outcomes, which was one specific question that was directed towards you, Assistant Director. So over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. To outline some of the achievement or the success stories of the ministry, I'm going to say that, as I mentioned earlier, in decision making in the area of politics, is the effort of the ministry and the mobilization the ministry, did that, made it to be possible for us to have almost 35%, which is the specification of the affirmative action for women in the political, position. And I also say there's also this conscious effort, which has led to a very good relationship. The Nigerian Ministry of Women Affairs, the gender machinery, has a cordial relationship with the civil society organization. That this rapport between us and them, which shows is an achievement, because we need them, because they are the watchdog to what the ministry is doing. I will also say it is also the advocacy of the ministry that has made the president to give a directive to the key, economic ministries like Agric and Ministry of Finance and other areas to ensure that economic empowerment of women is ensured. Right now, a memorandum of understanding is being signed to ensure that women economic empowerment is increased to the to the level it ought to be. And I also want to mention that to tell you we are ready to measure what we are doing. There's already a scorecard online to on ground to ensure that we are tracking our progress. We're also tracking whatever gaps we have, the challenges we have. All these are all in place to ensure that progress are made. And there's something I want to mention. Somebody mentioned in the tweet that the ministry is not working. The ministry is rather putting down the women than ensuring equality. I stand to correct that impression. For here is not true. The ministry has an issue, and this issue we have is the issue of underfunding, and we depend solely on the development partners to support what we are doing. In that kind of scenario, you will be, rest assured to say that we are really hindered to do so much. No matter the plans, no matter the the things we have on hand to to ensure that women are empowered, we cannot do much. This is also an opportunity to call on the African governments to ensure that the gender ministries, machineries are adequately funded, because they have agreed on issues of equality, on issues of equity. So it should also be good for them to fund gender machineries so that they can operate optimally. And secondly, there's the issue of capacity. As I said earlier, there's an inadequate capacity, and it's also been threatened the more with the emerging issues that are coming. So you keep on depleting this to make sure that every area gets attention. At the end of the day, you see like as if the results are not there, but the results are there. If we can also build enough capacity, have skilled manpower to handle issues of gender, I assure you that greatly we will score greater goals.
Sorry, I'm putting myself into the picture here just for a follow-up and not wanting to take over from you, Sheila. But I think what Nkechi just mentioned is worth a little bit of explanation, further explanation. The scorecard that you are referring to is actually an instrument that the current president of Nigeria has introduced. So every minister has a scorecard, which is an M&E tool to evaluate their performance. as far as I know, but please correct me, and please forgive us, you're a civil servant and you don't normally put civil servants on the spot, but it's in the interest of this discussion to do a little bit of that. Is this scorecard for the Minister of Women Affairs a public thing? Do we know what she is being held accountable for? Which would be interesting to know. You know, how does Nigeria measure progress in terms of women's advancement or protection of women's rights? And secondly, we were just discussing in the break that the Ministry of Women Affairs in Nigeria sees itself as also a coordinating ministry. It's not like the ministry decides something, this is what the women of Nigeria need, and then implements it. This needs to be implemented at the level of the Ministry of Agriculture, as you said, the Ministry of Finance, and so many other ministries. So if there is so much coordination for what are really core practical issues to women in agriculture, it's about fertilizer allocation, it's about access to education, it goes right across. But maybe the only passionate people are sitting in your ministry. So the level of holding to account is so many. And we were going to talk about how women can hold your ministry to account, the Ministry of Women Affairs. But how do you hold the other ministries to account? Maybe that would be a way into discussing this issue of accountability. Sheila, with your permission, I will just hand it back to Nkechi. But shout if that's not the right procedure.
Yes, that's a good idea. Thank you. It's a good question. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And the ministry is a coordinating ministry because issues of gender is a cross-cutting issue, and as such, the ministry cannot undertake every issues of development as per the gender issues. And as such, the ministry is there to provide policy guidelines, policy directions, and at times do some pilot projects to show the way as a prototype of what others will do. That is the essence of creating the gender focal point that I mentioned earlier. These gender focal points are found in all the line ministries in the country. It's also found among the CSOs. It's also found in every sector. So that's like in agriculture, as Christian mentioned. So we have a gender focal point. So what is Agric bringing on board? And the ministry had trained the gender focal point. And each ministry trained as per their core competence. What is Agric doing for women? The capacity have been built on how to mainstream gender in Agric, in water resources, in different capacities are being built along each core competence. How are we tracking our success story or the problems we are encountering? Well, the president in his own wisdom has established this scorecard measurement. It's an AMIE tool. So each agency comes on board to say what it has done. And when you're talking it, it's in a segregated manner. For women, what has been done by Agric, for what has been done in health, what has been done in every, depending on the area. So each group says what they have done, and from there you should be able to, and it's now the role of the ministry, the minister will now lead an advocacy to those agencies to say, well, in this area, much has not been done. Because I could remember in the area of health, it was discovered that, the primary health centers are not working. So the minister had to undertake an advocacy to the Minister of Health. From there, there was upscaling of the primary health centers. Ambulances were bought. People with this MSS midwife scheme, capacity were enhanced. So it's something like that. So in as much as we don't work in every area, but we are there to coordinate. We give the policy direction. We also coordinate activities. There's also a forum to discuss achievements and what have been the progress report. So in this event, we're able to track what each ministry is doing. And the president has made it so better that everybody comes, every agency, every sector comes in the public arena to read, to say, and discuss with the public what they have done. So issues are raised. What have you done for the children? What have you done for? It's a public domain thing. Everybody's open thing. Nobody hides it. So it's not the ministry now talking. No, the ministry also now drawing inspiration from it to now know the area of advocacy they will carry on. So public are asking questions. You say you've done for this for children, you've done this for women, so you have not done so much. Some even we mentioned some typical villages where nothing of such has happened in a case of lies. So people are there to also debunk if there's any lie. So people are there to debunk, and the respective agencies, sectors, or ministers are there to answer for themselves why they have not done and when they want to do. And from there, the ministry pick it up to now do advocacy to ensure that the interests of women are, are covered in every sector. So that's how we are doing the coordination. That's how we are monitoring results and ensuring that the gender is mainstream in every sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like now to hand over to Jennifer, who will respond from a civil society perspective, I think, to some of these questions. I think they are important. I think this issue of accountability is a critical one, and how we do it is important. So, Jennifer, here we are.
I just wanted to say that from a South African perspective, I think what's holding us back largely in having state interventions impact successfully is the structural tension, in the sense that we have the independent watchdog body, the CGE, and we have the ministry, which have to some extent are fighting over the crumbs whilst patriarchy gets the cake. So I'd say that the state interventions are probably not impacting largely on improving women's equality in South Africa. I think our implementation is falling far short, and I think that is to some extent to do with the political will. I have a sense that these structures would all work better, and women that move into state bodies from the women's movement would have more freedom to push an agenda if there was a benevolent atmosphere in the male spaces, which allowed them to speak more freely. Not sure that we have that in practice. From a civil society point of view, we're quite interested in how this mainstreaming has affected the discourse in society, because one of the results of mainstreaming has been a lot of campaigns. So we have a 16 days campaign, we have a Black Thursday, a red ribbon, and I understand that the ministry and now our newly formed Gender-Based Violence Council are again going to be looking at campaigns. And one of the downfalls of a campaign, well, there are two actually that we see. The one is it desensitizes society to inequality and the horror of the levels of violence against women. So instead of being shocked by someone being raped, we now see that every day, and they have to be disemboweled, or it has to be a baby before we are horrified. And secondly, there's been a shift to focus on quotas and numbers and formal equality as opposed to substantive equality. And there's a sense then that yes, we are doing something. We're going to have 50% of women, and we're going to pass the Women Empowerment Bill, but we're actually not really addressing the underlying inequality. And because there are all these campaigns, we're not taking to the streets, and we're not protesting, and we're not horrified, because we feel like something is being done. So I think from a civil society point of view, in a way, the state has taken away some of our voice.
That's a very interesting perspective. Now I'd like to throw the floors open to our participants who've quietly been listening and thinking. So if there are questions, please, would you raise your hand? Shall we start in Kenya, the Kenyan table?
Thank you. All right. Participants in the room, we've been listening to a very interesting debate, and now we have a chance to throw in our perspectives or question some of the perspectives that have come out from the panel. Please feel welcome. Let me see by your hands. Any questions in the room? Okay, thank you. Sorry, allow me to very quickly introduce Wahu Kara. She's a very renowned gender activist, and we are very pleased to have her. Sorry, she sneaked in a little bit while we were in discussion, but we are around the state sphere and questioning patriarchy and state interventions. and how we need to counter patriarchy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and that's why I cannot shy to come in, although I am quite late, because this is a belated topic, an issue that we have been battling with. I see my friend Professor Jacqueline Udol here, and I see my good mentor Rose Warohio here. So I'm comfortable because I know they have already laid on the table what I would want to say. This subject, as we discuss it today, it is not an accident or a coincidence. Let me start by saying so, because we are moved by social dynamics, political dynamics, economic dynamics. That is what makes the state on the arena, that's what makes history, on the arena of the state. And I see like this discussion has moved from the state to political sphere and to economic sphere, if I look your post as well. So I'm only trying to bring myself to the table. And my submission is that this is a historical reality, a time that we all must address the question of patriarchy. And patriarchy, in a very simple, demystified definition, it is to understand the location of where power is located. And throughout history, power has been located where man is, and therefore man dictates what politics we do, dictates what economics we do. And when I say man, it's not all men, it is those men in power, those men who control the resources, because the whole question of our life is about resources, access of resources, creating wealth out of these resources, and distributing of that wealth. And that is now the biggest question, because as we speak of globalization, where the power to control resources has been globalized and is located very well within the arrangement of who control the military hardware, who control from the military hardware, we go also to agribusiness, we go to pharmaceutical, we go to the insurance, and all that locates itself in the banks, where we have the power of finance capital within very few hands who happen to be men. So they dictate what we watch in the TV, what we teach in school, what we pray in our faith areas, in churches, in mosques, and everywhere, how we relate with one another. And that construction for over 500 years has continued to be re-engineered and recreated and reconstructed to continue serving the purpose of those who feel who control. The question now is that I think they have lacked capacity to think differently. And that's why I sit here as a very proud woman, because the solutions are with us women. And not only that, I also pride myself to be an African woman. The solutions are here in Africa and here in Kenya. And I say this because the patriarchy arrangement will have to be addressed with what I call horizontal participatory democracy on matters of politics and governance, which we have demonstrated it possible here in Kenya. Then on issues of economics, we must go to subsistence distributive economy that is in the domain of women. So the systemic question of patriarchy that we have tried to address as women in our struggles, from Mexico to Nairobi to Beijing and to present day, we will have to review that and locate the question of power and exercise power as women to engage and to stay engaged in dismantling patriarchy, because it doesn't work. It doesn't work for men, it doesn't work for women, it doesn't work for the youth, it doesn't work for anybody. So the 21st century demands new inspiration, new visions, and alternatives that are going to serve life, but not the interest of profit, which is in the hands of very few men. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Exactly. You can hear the excitement in the South African chamber here, where this speaks to how we perceive the world as well. I think it is indeed an African phenomenon. So thank you very much, Wakokara. That's an inspirational intervention. Thank you. I would now like to ask the table in South Africa whether they have questions they'd like to raise. Yeliwe Clark, here she comes.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the presentations. I didn't catch the Kenyan presentation, so I won't ask any particular question there. I'll give an example of what I heard from Nigeria, but it's a question I think that can be applied to all the conversations around gender ministries. Yesterday in the opening keynote address, Shireen Hassim talked about, yes, there was the question of women in leadership, and in the response to her paper, a Nigerian feminist, I think her name was Keisha. So there was a point about the difficulty that Nigerian women have been facing, which was on top of what's happening in Nigeria. So it was interesting for me to hear that in Nigeria, women are not going into positions of public political leadership because it's such a harsh space. It's a dirty game. And the politics in Nigeria are so dirty that therefore the numbers of women going into politics are really small. So thinking of that reality, I was wondering the Ministry for Women and Gender in Nigeria, how are they navigating that space? Because if politics are so harsh and dirty, and we have our own version of it in South Africa, you know, what it means to stand up and say something in South Africa during the Zuma rape trial, I think that was a very potent example of what it means to stand up and say something against a ruling party. And in Nigeria has had this history of coup d'etats, military governments, and in fact the establishment of the ministry. I remember reading an article by Amina Mama that actually the ministry was established almost by force by a particular wife. We had the minister's wives and the president's wives syndrome that we have across the continent and in other countries outside Africa. So we know that these ministries have this history of allegiance to political leadership, mostly men and wives of political leaders. How has the Nigerian ministry navigated itself out of that history? And how is it dealing with the dirty politics that Nigerian women, you know, are struggling to deal with and therefore not going into political decision-making positions? Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Are there any questions?
Okay, coming up, I think somebody's beckoning me across here. Rose Waruhio, welcome.
Hello, Rose. Thank you.
Hi, Sheila, and thank you for steering the morning sessions going well. And it was very great to hear Jacqueline talk. We know Jacqueline in the women's movement for many years. So my first question to her was what it meant for her to be in government. And I realize she has remained faithful to the women's cause. So we are proud to have you back. And what I'm taking personally, I think, from today's meeting or today's discussion is the challenge that we face, or whether we have a government which is popular and which we support, what kind of structures we can create that help us to interact or to keep influencing what is happening. In other words, the Jubilee government has made the right statements. They have created the structures, but something always bothers me. If you have a very, very urgent matter or a serious matter, because the priorities that government picks must have some benefit to them, you know, even in their next campaign. We also have a system in Kenya where you have malaria, it's declared a disaster, you have some other disaster, and the whole government moves to achieve certain benchmarks. think dealing with the issue of gender has never been an urgent matter in Kenya. And the kind of steps that need to be made require some urgent or quick movement to make sure that it becomes part of government policy. It's not a women's issue. We are supposed to be very happy that we have new ministers who are women, but that's not what we are looking for. How does an officer sitting at a desk become required to understand what is gender? The same way they have to understand procurement rules, the same way they have to understand what a government circular means. And because I heard about Nigeria, they have a system there. I think they were calling it, they have some kind of checklist. We have a system in Kenya called performance contracting. I think that should be our first priority. How are we going to check or monitor that the performance contracting and the assessment of government officers, they get awards based on performance? How can we get gender to be a primary issue at that level, besides what I said earlier about us creating our own mechanism again to monitor? So it becomes internalized. It's not a question that you have a woman minister, you have a new commission, you have a woman there. The way Kenya government works, and it is very, very efficient, is that there are basic, not just skills, but requirements about how you work. How do we get gender to be one of the indicators for their assessment? I think this would be a great achievement for us. Thank you.
Professor Sheila, over to you.
I'm going to give a last question to our table because time is running out in this session, and then I'm going to ask the speakers to respond, and then we'll close the session for lunch. Thank you.
So, yeah, hi, my name is Karen. I'm from the Heinrich Böll Foundation in South Africa. My question is, or I guess the question for all of us that's been posed, especially by your presentation, Jennifer, is what should we, firstly, actually, to us as activists, what should we be lobbying for as feminist activists? Should we be lobbying for against women's ministries, for instance, against state machineries, or how should we be making them work better? And the question to the representatives of the state machineries that we've seen speak from Kenya and Nigeria is, what would you want activists to do to strengthen you? Or how do you see your role or your interaction with the women's movement? What kind of interaction would you find useful and empowering? Thank you.
Thank you very much. From the ground wants one question, so I'm going to allow it. We have with us some activists from the New Women's Movement here in Cape Town, and we are very delighted to have you here, incidentally. Thank you very much for coming. So I'm going to give over to Mama Dalina to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. Good afternoon, everybody. My question is based on as we are here and as we are, I can say this meeting is globally because we are not alone. As women on the ground and as grassroots level organization, which now are dying and they were doing the good job of being concerned with the grassroots level women who can't speak for themselves. And then we empowered ourselves to be the voices of those who are voiceless. What can we do globally? Because women are on business and women want to be on business, but there's no support, there's no capital. And secondly, to Jennifer, on crime that is in Cape Town, I can say in South Africa as a whole, there is a lot of crime in schools, satanism, housebreaking, rape, elderly abuse everywhere. And also, the law is not protecting us. What action must all we take? Because we don't have lovely sleeping in our places, because housebreaking at night, you just get somebody in your house, you've got no weapon, and anything may happen. So I just need, what can we do as women together with one voice? Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to ask for responses from our speakers. And if we could start with Nigeria, so that if you could respond to some of the questions which were directed in general towards the you directly, but also in the question that Karen asked: in what ways would you want to see civil society engaging with you?
Thank you. First and foremost, I want to correct the impression that Nigerian politics is dirty. It's very dirty. No, it's not true. I want to disagree with that, because that's not a good, good statement. And I want to tell you, whatever Nigerian women are, facing as per challenges, in politics, is like a issue of patriarchy we are talking about. The women are not supposed to be expected to be in the political arena. Just that's what it is. It's not because it is so dirty here. It is so, no, I disagree with that. But what are the roles of the ministry? What role has the ministry play to ensure that these are being taken care of? Already the ministry, before the last election, the ministry went on to went on advocacy to the political parties in the country, and they had a part. But it does appear that that part did not work very well. So the ministry is now strategizing, and the new strategy is to get the political parties in Nigeria to sign an MOU, on what they say, we are going on for the 35% in the affirmative action. So each party will need to, sign a part with the ministry that they will need to feature women. The women need to be given a certain percentage at all levels of, from the local level up to the federal level. That's what the ministry is doing. The ministry is also, lobbying the Independent Electoral Commission, which is a body that, handles election in Nigeria, to ensure that, when they are signing whatever thing they are doing with the political parties, the issue of gender mainstreaming should be at the fore. So that if we can get it at the party level, we'll use this Independent Electoral Commission to ensure that women are fully represented at the in decision-making positions. And because the women couldn't get much of the positions the last election, that's why the ministry now, use this another option which the president, supported, by using appointive positions. And the president, granted this to the women. Right now, as I said, we have 33% positions, appointive positions. That's a way to cover up for the losses we had in the last, if they're not occupying, enough space. And the ministry is also lobbying the legislators, so that every area they need to, they need anything they need to do to make sure that the women are mainstream in political arena, they will do it, so that we don't need to say maybe it's because the laws are not there to put them in power. So the ministry is also, lobbying with the collaboration of the civil society organization. I also mentioned the issue of trust fund. There's a trust fund for women politicians. the essence of the trust fund is to build the capacity of these politicians. Not enough to get position, it's also enough to, you know, deliver on that position. So we are building the capacity and grooming them on what to do as politicians, as well as, you know, funding their elections. We're also building the capacity for the female parliamentarians on governance and issues of gender. Just as I said, it's not enough to be in power, it's also enough to deliver for the, you know, deliver to the women. Well, another question came, what do we expect from the women groups? Already we have a good working relationship with the women groups, but I want them to lobby on human rights issues. Because when they lobby on human rights issues, it will go a long way to, you know, it will go a long way to handle issues of patriarchy. We also want them to lobby on. There are so many, you know, bills in the National Assembly. We also want them to lobby so that those bills will be passed. There are also some international documents that need to be domesticated, which are yet to be domesticated. The ministry will also want them to lobby on that. Already we have a cordial relationship with them. So the ministry have all their support to engage in every area they want to engage, to make sure that I will dismantle, you know, dismantle patriarchy in the country. Thank you very much.
I'd like Prof. Jacqueline Goodwell now to respond to the questions that were raised.
Thank you, Sheila. So first to Rose, thank you for the comments, and specifically in the gender machinery in Kenya. First, I would like to correct that I am not a representative of the gender machinery in Kenya, because I stopped being permanent secretary in June 2013. I am on the panel really to bring to the table the collective energies, inspiration, and experience. And I'm speaking on this based on knowledge, especially since I was the accounting officer at the transition from the ministry to the Directorate of Gender. And so to say that in terms of how to ensure that there is a management and a check against having a situation where priority of sometimes the political leaders becomes more pronounced as opposed to the clearly defined experiences in the country. I would want to indicate that there is the framework that is the blueprint, Vision 2030, and there is also a very clear understanding and recognition of Millennium Development Goals and how we are talking about post-2015, and that with these kinds of reference development agenda, we have in the structural arrangements of the Directorate of Gender posted the officers that were initially in the Department of Gender in the Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Development are now in the ministries that are headed by the respective sector cabinet secretaries, precisely with the recognition that they need to strengthen and augment the gender focal points that were existing in those ministries, but that might not have had the technical know-how and the experience to ensure that every frontline officer, right from the central government here in Nairobi to the counties, is held accountable. And this then is linked to the performance contract. And I know that Rose happened to witness that the other day the performance contract was signed, and the cabinet secretaries, the president, and the respective principal secretaries were all in attendance. And the performance contract draws very directly from the key blueprints of the development. And I want to indicate that when we look at Vision 2030, we will see that we have the pillars: economic, social, and political. And we are here with the chairperson of the Women Enterprise Fund, Anne Mutai, and we'll see that there are very clear targets that are defined and which are used to appraise the performance of those cabinet secretaries. And so I would want to indicate that there is an arrangement within the state. I do believe, however, based on the question that had been raised on Twitter before, that there seems to be a situation in which sometimes the state-driven initiatives overshadow those others, that I think it brings me to the second question, that we need to then say, if the state, the national machineries, have undertaken to define or to work on these targets, and if they have themselves, because in a performance contracting system, you yourself choose your targets. And you might then choose a target that might be of your interest and not necessarily the one that is of the greatest need, whether it is health, education, or any other areas. This, in my view, is where now the question that came from our sister in South Africa comes in, that we would want to see that the national machinery is seen as just one mechanism of intervention. Given the very deep-rooted nature of patriarchy, and given the way in which the mindsets of not only women who occupy positions, but others in terms of addressing issues, I would strongly urge that the civil society, especially the women's organizations, seek to monitor in a way, the way that South Africa is doing, what the state has set as their targets, and take issue even with the chosen targets if they do not seem to match the concerns and priorities. I would also say that it would be useful, as has been seen to be a good practice, that conversation and communication with the civil society or the women's movement is not ad hoc. It is not left to the discretion of, say, a cabinet secretary or any political leader, but there should be a manner in which there is a predictable, formal channel of communication. I would also say that I believe that there needs to be some way of getting the national machinery to explain how this machinery is linking, because we are now clear that we have a directorate, and it is under the Ministry of Devolution and Planning, but we know there is a Directorate of Planning, Directorate of Devolution, and we are really, in terms of my expectation, need to know how does this then come from that level of the cabinet secretary to the woman in the village, the woman and the man. I think this is something that needs to be clearly raised, and also the relationship between the national machinery and the statutory constitutional body, National Gender and Equality Commission. I think this question needs to be raised by the activists, by the movement, in how the Women Parliamentary Association and other partners like the UN Women link. And finally, to really also ask that to avoid the manner in which patriarchy turns women against one another, which is really a very well-established mechanism, that there be a manner and a deliberate way to see how those women who get into state positions or into parliament or into any other position of leadership can be connected to the other women who are in the movement or at the village without making them look like they are only representing women. Because I like my sister Wahoo as she spoke, but I'm sure you know that if Wahoo walked into a cabinet meeting and spoke the way she did, perhaps the point that she was expressing might not necessarily be as well received the way it was received by us here as an audience. So I think it is time that as we seek to dismantle the enemy of patriarchy, that we then also become strategic. And then we say, how do we support and ensure that the woman who is at that position can actually be seen, because she is capable, to engage on an equal basis, but to have as a very clear agenda and linkage the woman at the village being on her side, not the way it is sometimes here in Kenya, where the women who are out are actually saying that those who are in are really, in a way, betraying them. And I conclude by telling and requesting this virtual conference that we could have a predictable alumni or meeting. It could even be virtual like this one, where women who are in positions of leadership are connecting to women at the grassroots and are connecting to women who are in the organizations so that they can feed in the issues, and the women will tell them, this issue, this one we can handle, but this one I think you could need to handle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to ask Jennifer here in Cape Town to respond to the questions from a civil society perspective. Thank you.
I actually don't have a lot to add. I agree with much of what Jacqueline has said in relation to the machinery. I just wanted to say, in relation to the one question about what should feminists be advocating for, I think we should be advocating for dismantling patriarchy and implementing gender equality. In relation to what does that mean for gender machinery, I think we in South Africa need to have a very clear sense of what we see as a functional gender machinery. So we have to go, to some extent we've done that with the CGE, but now we have to look at the women's ministry. And we have to look at if there is a role and a space for both of them. They may not be mutually exclusive, but what do we want each of them to be doing, and how do we think they should do it? So that we need to be right on the structure. But secondly, I also think people are important. You know, the public protector has, in South Africa, had this similar structure for many years, but has been more effective when it's had strong independent women leading it as it is now. So I think we also need to be very careful as to not getting lost in quotas and numbers. There are capable women out there, and I think they need to be pushed into positions of power and given independence so that they can speak out. And we need to advocate for an enabling environment so that they can do so. And that really means challenging the politics head on, and challenging the lack of political will head on. A lot has been said about the performance indicators, and I think the ministry of the planning ministry is a great place to put some of the gender budgeting and operationalizing of gender mainstreaming in inverted commas. And we had actually advocated for that before the ministry was set up at the Women's Legal Center. But be that as it may, I think that's got to run all the way down to the ground. So in answer to Mama Dalina's question, how do we make the police respond to crime on the grassroots? That it must be in every single one of their performance contracts. There must be indicators that are set by us, that are in the law, which create positive duties, which are in their contracts, that if they're not doing their job, they must be fired. So I think it's not just, we need to filter it all the way down from the highest level to right to the people on the ground who are implementing things. And lastly, I think we need to take back that space, that protest space. I think we need to go back to the streets, and we need to take that space and make it our own, and start speaking out very loudly about women's issues, not service delivery, not economics, not poverty, but that this is a woman's issue. We are the woman.
Well, thank you very much to everybody for participating in this international discussion. And I just want to conclude by saying that we have national and international goals to which governments and countries are accountable. And women's movements, civil society, should use all the tools that are available to hold states to account. But we also need to be aware of the limitations of relying on states for transformation. Transformation is in our own hands. Take back the space. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your lunch.